All right. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay, so the synchronicity talk kind of tapped into our topic a little bit, which makes for a nice little segue. And our category is consciousness, brain, and death. And the talk we chose to review is called After: What Do Near-Death Experiences Mean for the Next Life and for This Life, from the Scientific and Medical Network. And in the talk, we learn about Professor Bruce Greyson's 50 years of experience in studying near-death experiences and the common traits of hundreds of different cases and how the experiences affect the lives of the experiencer. And on the next slide, we see Professor Greyson opens the talk by talking of the challenges of studying a near-death experience, such as finding unbiased samples and the inevitability of the experience, or people just not wanting to disclose that they had the experience out of fear of ridicule or even going against their cultural norms. And on the next slide, we see from these challenges, Professor Greyson talked about why they created the NDE scale in order to create consistency, to establish these as real experiences and not a product of imagination. So from the scale, it was found that there are consistent cross-cultural features, such as changes in thinking and feeling and newfound ethics. And 30% of NDE experiences describe having a life review or other realms and mystical beings. And on the next slide, Professor Greyson discussed the proposed physiological experiences that some people assume contribute to an NDE, like the person must have had lack of oxygen to the brain that caused hallucinations, or the drugs given to the patient must have caused illusions. And some say that an NDE is just wishful thinking on the part of the patient, or sometimes they say it's just possible mental illness. But Dr. Greyson reviews the data and concludes that these are not contributing factors that cause an NDE. On the next slide, we see that we learned that the NDE suggests the relationship between our minds and brains, including the possibility that our minds may survive after we die, which could explain phenomena like terminal lucidity, where a person was unresponsive for an extended period of time, suddenly has a burst of energy and clarity prior to death. So many philosophers and researchers believe that the mind is outside of our bodies and the brain is merely an interpreter or tuner of mind at large. And it acts as a filter to keep us tuned into our animalistic survival skills to focus on material needs necessary for survival in the world. And the next slide, we talk about survival of the mind after death of the body is only possible if consciousness or mind is separate from the body. And Professor Greyson concludes that we are conscious not because of the brain, but actually in spite of it. And this topic has proven important because of what NDE tells us about living a more meaningful and fulfilling life before we die. And on the last slide, we have takeaways from the talk that NDEs are common, they're normal, happen to normal people. They have profound after effects, and they kind of suggest that the mind functions independent of the brain and may function beyond death. And most importantly, the conclusion of NDEs is that we are all interconnected. And now we have Tim White, who can give us a firsthand description of his own near-death experience.
Thank you, Geraldine. So I had a near-death experience about 21 years ago. I had a bit of a troubled childhood and kind of came straight out of school, got into drugs and crime. And then one night I overdosed on heroin and was dead for about 2 to 3 minutes before my wife was able to bring me back. And I experienced many of the things that other people who've had near-death experiences report. So I had a life review where I experienced everything that I'd done from the position of other people that were involved in it, which was not a particularly pleasant experience given where my life was at that time. I had visions of my future, my daughter's future. My granddad was there, who died about 10 years earlier. And I had a real sense of being enveloped in a white light and being sent back with clear instructions to be better. And it's had a transformative effect on my life. I did leave my wife at the time, got clean, went back to university, did a degree, got a job, work in local government now because it kind of helps people. And it really completely changed my worldview. But to give a bit of context around, sort of near-death experiences, these aren't new occurrences. And Gregory Shushin, in a recent presentation for the Beyond the Brain conference, highlighted that they've been recorded for thousands of years, as far back as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and right across the world as well. With probably more notable for the exceptions where they don't happen, such as Africa, Australasia, and Micronesia. Which is argued that it is to do with their attitudes towards the dead. But where NDEs appear culturally, they have a fairly uniform set of commonly reported features, apart from the life review, which is a relatively Western concept, along with the idea that NDEs are caused by the brain. So Nelson 2015 has suggested that 9 of the near-death features can be explained by neuroscience, and the table on the screen there kind of gives you an example of what those are and how he thinks they can be explained. And Marshall et al. Are adamant that you can't really understand NDEs without neuroscience, because NDE research frequently conflates the mechanisms of the brain dying with the subjective experiences that people report. Other studies have suggested that perhaps gamma band activity during the near-death stage of the death process could be what causes NDEs, although there are studies by Nigel Shaw, I believe, that suggest that that might not be the case. However, Lutz et al. Have shown the same sort of gamma band activity within experienced Buddhist meditation practitioners, both post and during meditation practice. And Van Gordon et al. Have also done an extended study over time with Buddhist practitioners who are able to consciously bring on NDEs and retain control over them, as well as have the sort of encounters that other people report. And now I'll hand over to Jeanette with a critique. You're on mute, Jeanette.
Sorry. It seems presumptuous to be critiquing one of the giants in the field of near-death experiences and such a great scientist, but we will offer some reflections. Next slide, please. As we've seen from Tim's account, near-death experiences are complex phenomena. They're complicated in part because it's hard to define ineffable experience, and people can confuse correlation and causality. Also, near-death experiences go to the heart of questions about the nature of reality and the hard problem of consciousness, and of course, our own survival after death and its implications for how we live. Next slide, please. In studying near-death experiences, some people say, matter is all we can study, so let's look for empirical evidence, the physiological correlates of near-death experiences. But Professor Greyson and others say that we need to include a non-local dimension of mind. While NDEs, of course, they've got spiritual and physical aspects, but physiological stress and psychological factors can't explain them. But maybe neurobiological correlates can help us understand how near-death experiences are mediated. Professor Greyson's presentation offers a spiritual paradigm to help people find connection, meaning, and purpose in life. But his talk doesn't really fully explore the insights from correlates. Next slide, please. Physiological triggers or correlates may help us understand how near-death experiences are mediated, and we've already heard of a few of these. In an exchange between Professor Greyson and Pascal Michael, though, Michael suggests that there is now enough evidence to say that terminal neural activity may contribute physiologically to near-death experiences. And also, looking at neurobiological correlates of near-death experiences doesn't necessarily have to be reductionist, because they still allow for the possibility of non-local consciousness. Next slide, please. Professor Greyson is at pains to separate out mental health problems from near-death experiences. And he says psychological factors don't cause near-death experiences. Anyone can have one. But some personality traits and cognitive profiles do seem to correlate with near-death experiences, and they make having near-death experiences more likely. Next slide, please. In the same vein, Professor Greyson says that trauma doesn't cause near-death experiences. But if at some level near-death experiences are an attempt to make sense of ineffable experience through top-down processing, and if severe threat can cause dissociative symptoms, then maybe the memories laid down by earlier dissociative trauma can predispose us to having near-death experiences, and that need not be a pathological process. Next slide. Thank you. Professor Greyson says that near-death experiences point to a continued existence beyond death, things like out-of-body experiences and terminal lucidity. But Pascal Michael and others say that some of these experiences can also be explained by physiological factors and parapsychological processes. So we need more evidence of the survival hypothesis. And of course, seeing a dimension of reality or a part of our psyche that we don't normally have access to because of something that happens just before we die doesn't mean that we will have access to it after death. Next slide, please. Professor Greyson doesn't mention distressing near-death experiences in his talk, though he answers the questions about it in the Q&A. We don't know much about distressing near-death experiences, and we may be underestimating their incidence. Professor Greyson's NDE scale was based on commonalities in experience as they were reported. But that turned out to be problematic because distressing near-death experiences aren't much mentioned. Perhaps people don't like to talk about them. So there were no questions about them or about negative emotions included in the Greyson scale. Slightly different point, some classical features of a near-death experience were also associated with NDE-like events where there is no threat to life. So it would have been more interesting to hear more about Professor Greyson's later research into these areas. And it begs the question whether Professor Greyson and other researchers are sidestepping distressing near-death experiences because it's not something people want to hear about. And that leads us on to ethical considerations, which Geraldine Clark will tell us about.
Thanks, Jeanette. And in the talk, Professor Greyson talks about the common ethical theme that has occurred with near-death experiencers, which is change in attitude, beliefs, and behaviors, which is quite different from the way they were before the NDE. And some believe that's due to having what's described as a life review. And in this review, people are reported to relive their life in detail again and experience all they have done. But this time they get to experience how their actions affected those around them. They feel every good and bad deed, and this time they get to see it from the perspective of the other people in their interactions. And the next slide. And in his book, Hole in One, The Near-Death Experience and the Ethic of Interconnectedness, David Lorimer refers to this as empathetic resonance, which is defined as the direct perception of an underlying web of interconnectedness and interdependence among human beings and indeed all life. And Professor Greyson gives an example to illustrate this with a story of a young man named Tom who, as a teenager, had an altercation with a drunk man, turned into a fist fight. Tom ended up beating this man bloody and left him there alone. And later in life, Tom had this near-death experience and a life review where he experienced this whole event again, but this time got to feel it from the perspective of the drunk man. He felt the disorientation of being inebriated. He felt all 32 blows that bloodied his nose and cut his lip and left him humiliated. And Tom realized that what he did to this man, he really did to himself, and that there is no separateness from us and from others. And next slide. These type of experiences are very common in a near-death experience that leaves the person feeling they don't want to cause harm to anyone or anything the rest of their lives. They now view adages like the golden rule of do unto others as you would have others do unto you, not only as a guideline, but how the law of nature in which everything you do to others literally is what you do to yourself. This feeling of interconnectedness has caused the near-death experiencer to find meaning and purpose behind life's events from which there's an opportunity to learn and grow. Life is no longer something that happens to you, but something that happens for you, allowing you to benefit on a soul level from these occurrences. And the next slide. After an NDE, people tend to value life more and no longer are interested in material things like power and prestige. They tend to put more value into relationships with others and feel a sense of duty to be of service to those in need. So strong is this change in beliefs that sometimes a person who experiences an NDE will want to change careers to do something they feel is more meaningful and of service to others, and have even gone into healthcare, teaching, counseling, and even clergy to align more with their newfound beliefs. And next slide. Before an NDE, people found they went through life with blinders on, viewing everything with themselves as the central point of their existence and experiencing only one perspective. And what a near-death experience does is allow the person to view life from not only their own perspective, but from a place of how their actions influence those around them. They even see themselves as co-creators of their life experiences, and every occurrence is viewed as an opportunity to be a positive influence and to make a difference. And now we have Michaela to talk more about the future direction.
Thanks, Geraldine. Okay, so I am looking at further research into near-death experience, NDE, that involves improving patient care. So the dying process is an area of which very little is known and has been largely ignored by scientific investigation. However, recently, patient experiences from cardiac arrest have begun to shed a light on the likely state of the human mind at the end of life. And interestingly, a significant amount of these survivors recall unusual experiences, characteristic of near-death experience as described by Tim. These events raise important questions regarding current views on the nature of human consciousness and its relationship with the brain. So let's look at this further. Next slide, please. In 2016, the study AWARE-2 followed 567 men and women who suffered cardiac arrest during hospital stays. Only hospitalized patients were enrolled in order to standardize the resuscitation methods, as well as recording methods for brain activity using EEG machines. 53 were successfully resuscitated and 28 were well enough to be interviewed. Next slide, please. Among other interesting findings, which are shown on this slide that I won't discuss today because I don't have time, I do feel it important to mention that the AWARE-2 researchers concluded 20% of those interviewed had transcendental near-death experiences. And furthermore, following the NDE, patients developed a new sense of purpose and an increased compassion for self and others, as Geraldine and Tim discussed earlier. Next slide, please. So just how vivid experience emerges from a dysfunctional brain during cardiac arrest is a complete paradox, making it a prime area for future research. Lucid experiences should not occur at a time when global cerebral functions are impaired or absent. In the AWARE-2 study, researchers found that although most of the time the EEG measurements were flat during cardiac arrest, as we would expect, they did see spikes in brain waves that are associated with higher mental function. With this unusual finding, Dr. Parnia claims the recalled experience of death was real, as brain signals were notably different than brain signals from hallucinations, delusions, and delusions. So, does this finding show a marker of consciousness going on in the brain after death? Well, Professor Greyson suggests not, believing the team did not show any correlation between brain waves and conscious activity. Dr. Parnia argues that while studies have not been able to prove the meaning of patients' experience, it has been impossible to disclaim them either. So findings from the AWARE-2 study propose larger multi-center studies, including EEG monitored ICU patients who survive cardiac arrest, could provide much needed data to determine whether or not these bursts in activity are evidence of hidden consciousness. Research must also focus on patients' experiences during states of unconsciousness and how they impact longer-term physical outcomes in survivors. Next slide, please. I'll carry this theme on by looking at further considerations in end-of-life care for best practice in hospices and hospitals, etc. So Dr. Peter Fennick believes there is much in common between NDE and a phenomenon he named end-of-life experience, which is ELE. During ELE, patients report deathbed visions, onward journeys, and relatives report deathbed coincidences and other unusual phenomena. I've personally witnessed all aspects of ELE whilst nursing, and Dr. Fenwick suggests both NDE and ELE are part of the same process, and together they could be used as a therapeutic model for the stages of dying. I completely agree with this idea and believe nurses could help develop such a model. Next slide, please. So although NDE and ELE are prevalent and they have a positive impact on those in the dying stages, unfortunately, professionals little understand them. So it's proposed that training should be given in prevalence, forms, and impacts of such experience, using empathy instead of pathologizing the event. And further research must concentrate on refining the definition of NDE and ELE, and robust studies evaluating the diverse clinical variables involved should be undertaken. This will deliver a better understanding of their impact on those near the end of life. And from a clinical point of view, the question of what a person experiences when they face death is a very real issue with everyday practical implications. And a knowledge of this process will help carers deal with the anxiety of patients facing death. So I'll pass you on to Jeanette to conclude. Thanks.
So we've seen that near-death experiences are complex. There's no one explanation. Tim has shared with us his own experience of near-death experiences, which supports Professor Greyson's findings. And it demonstrated the impact of near-death experiences in terms of empathetic resonance, transformative power, and the ability to be life-changing. The phenomenon of near-death experiences goes to the heart of questions about reality and life after death. We need an ontological pluralism, a holding together of empirical science and the possibility of non-physical, non-local dimensions to reality. Near-death experiences are important for our increasingly polarized world. They're relevant to everyone because we're all going to die, so they form a bridge between all factions of humanity, and they offer a more transpersonal perspective. In addition to raising awareness of near-death experiences, we need to develop clinical applications and prepare people for death. Professor Greyson has offered an outstanding contribution to this field. Thank you.